You've probably seen the chart: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. 5 neat stages, moving in order, like a checklist you're supposed to complete after losing someone you love. Here's what almost nobody knows. That chart was never built for grief at all. It wasn't based on people who had lost someone. It came from a completely different group of people, studied for a completely different reason. And somewhere along the way, the world quietly attached it to something it was never designed to explain. If you've ever grieved wrong, skipped a stage, gotten stuck, felt angry again after you thought you'd reached acceptance, you weren't failing a process. You were failing a model that was mislabeled from the start. Last time, we opened the file on your own eyes and how little they actually show you. Today, we're opening something heavier: what loss actually does to a human mind, according to the research, not the poster. In 1969, psychiatrist Elizabeth Kübler-Ross published a book called On Death and Dying. Her research subjects were not grieving people. They were terminally ill patients, coming to terms with their own approaching deaths. Kübler-Ross interviewed patients who had been told they were dying and noticed common emotional patterns as they processed that news: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually, for some, acceptance. She never claimed these were a fixed sequence everyone must pass through in order. She never claimed they applied to people grieving someone else's death. Her original framework was specifically about facing one's own mortality, a narrow, specific population in a narrow, specific circumstance. But the model was simple, memorable, and comforting in its neatness. Within a few years, it had escaped its original context entirely. Grief counselors, hospital pamphlets, and eventually popular culture began applying the 5 stages to anyone who had lost a loved one. A completely different psychological experience that Kübler-Ross had never actually studied. By the time it reached the general public, the stages weren't a tentative observation about dying patients anymore. They were a rulebook for the bereaved. And rulebooks create a strange, quiet cruelty. If your grief doesn't move through the stages in order, you start to feel like you're doing it wrong, like there's a right way to lose someone, and you failed it. Kübler-Ross herself reportedly grew uncomfortable with how her work had been repurposed. In later writings, she tried to clarify that the stages were never meant to be linear, universal, or even fully separate from one another, that people could experience them in any order, skip some entirely, or feel several at once. But by then, the 5-stage chart had already become a cultural fixture, printed in hospital brochures and repeated in films, far faster than any correction could travel. A single, simplified diagram outpaced its own author's attempts to complicate it. This is worth sitting with for a moment. An entire generation's expectations about how loss is supposed to feel were shaped by a model built for a different population, studying a different experience that even its own creator later tried to walk back. For decades, psychology assumed that healthy grief required intense, prolonged emotional work, that you had to actively process and struggle through loss, or it would resurface later unresolved. Then a researcher named George Bonanno started actually measuring what happened to people over time. George Bonanno, a clinical psychologist at Columbia University, has spent over 2 decades tracking bereaved people using long-term longitudinal studies, checking in with the same individuals repeatedly over months and years after a loss. His data consistently shows something that contradicted the prevailing assumption. The most common trajectory after loss isn't a slow climb through stages of intense distress toward eventual acceptance. In most studied populations, a majority of people show what Bonanno calls a resilience pattern: real, genuine grief alongside a relatively stable ability to continue functioning, working, and even experiencing moments of joy, often within weeks or a few months. A smaller portion of people experience prolonged, more severe grief that does require additional support. But the resilient pattern, not the collapse then recover pattern, is what the data shows most often. This finding upset a lot of clinical assumptions when it came out, because it seemed to suggest something uncomfortable: that being able to laugh, work, or feel okay 2 weeks after a devastating loss doesn't mean you loved the person less, or that you're suppressing something dangerous. For most people, it's simply what a human mind resilient enough to survive loss actually looks like in real time. Bonanno's data also revealed a smaller group whose grief followed a different curve entirely. People who felt little distress even in the earliest days after a loss and remained that way throughout. For years, clinicians assumed this pattern must reflect suppressed or delayed grief that would eventually surface. But long-term follow-up on these same individuals rarely found a hidden collapse waiting somewhere down the road. Some people, it turns out, are simply less shattered by a given loss than others expect them to be. And that, too, falls within the range of a normal human response, not a warning sign of something being wrong beneath the surface. If grief isn't a five-stage staircase, and it isn't a simple collapse either, what does the actual shape of it look like? In 1999, researchers Margaret Strobel and Henk Schutt proposed what's now called the dual process model of grief. Instead of stages, they describe an oscillation, a back-and-forth movement between two very different modes. In loss-oriented moments, a person confronts the pain directly, crying, remembering, longing, dwelling on the person who's gone. In restoration-oriented moments, the same person turns toward practical life, distraction, new routines, even moments of genuine happiness, actively avoiding the pain, temporarily, in order to keep functioning. Strobel and Schutt's research suggests healthy grieving isn't choosing one mode and completing it before moving to the next. It's the ongoing, sometimes rapid oscillation between both, sometimes within the same afternoon. This explains something that confuses a lot of grieving people. Laughing at a joke at a funeral reception, then suddenly crying an hour later, then feeling strangely fine by dinner. That's not instability. Based on this research, that's closer to what functional grieving actually looks like. A related and equally important shift came from researchers Dennis Klass, Phyllis Silverman, and Stephen Nickman, who introduced what's called continuing bonds theory in 1996. Older grief models assumed the healthy endpoint of mourning was letting go, fully detaching from the deceased person so you could move on. Klass, Silverman, and Nickman's research on bereaved individuals found the opposite pattern in people who were coping well. They weren't severing their connection to the person who died. They were maintaining an ongoing, evolving relationship, continuing to talk to them internally, feel their presence in decisions, mark their birthday, or draw on their memory as an active source of guidance. Years later, the research suggests the old goal of grief work, closure, may never have been the healthy target at all. You're not supposed to stop loving them or stop including them. The relationship doesn't end. It changes shape. Put together, these three lines of research paint a very different picture than the five-stage poster ever did. Grief isn't a staircase you climb once, in order, toward a finish line called acceptance. For most people, it's closer to weather, genuine, functional, resilient most days, with real storms of loss-oriented pain moving through on others. For a relationship with the person that never fully closes, only settles into a new, ongoing form. So if the five stages were never built for this, and grief doesn't move in order, and letting go isn't even the real goal, what do you actually do with this information if you're grieving right now or supporting someone who is? The most useful thing the research offers isn't a new checklist to replace the old one. It's permission to stop checking. Grief researchers who study this now generally advise against measuring your grief against any fixed timeline or sequence. Instead, they suggest watching for function rather than emotion. Can you eat, sleep, work, and connect with others at least somewhat, even while still deeply sad? If yes, oscillating between sorrow and normal life, for as long as it takes, is not a sign that something is wrong. If the answer is consistently no for an extended period, if daily functioning stays severely disrupted for months, that's the actual signal that additional support, like a grief counselor or therapist, could genuinely help. Not because you're grieving wrong, but because some griefs are heavier than others, and support isn't a failure, it's simply care. There is no rulebook that tells you the correct order to miss someone in. There's no stage you're supposed to have finished by now. There's only the ongoing, oscillating, occasionally contradictory experience of carrying someone with you. A relationship that never fully ends, just changes what it needs from you day to day. If you're grieving something right now while watching this, that's not a system malfunction. It's the most human thing your mind knows how to do. Next time, we're going back to something lighter. Why you can taste a food you haven't eaten in 20 years the instant you smell it, and what that says about the strange, direct wiring between scent and memory that nothing else in your brain quite has. If you're ready to debug your life and reclaim your mind, hit that subscribe button. We uncover a new hidden code in the things you use, the thoughts you have, in the world you think you know. Until then, keep questioning the code.